Hello, Chats with Chelsi community. Welcome back to another episode. We continue with our Motherhood series, and I am so excited for today's guest. Dorina Gilmore-Young is here with us. She is a wife, mother of three. She's an author, avid runner, and she's a widow. And we're going to be talking about that today, along with her journey of how she has continued to raise three amazing children. So, Chats with Chelsi community, join me in welcoming Dorina to the show. Dorina, welcome.
Thank you, Chelsea. It's an honor to be here today.
Well, I am thrilled. Let's just jump in, because so far in this series, we have talked about a ton of different angles of motherhood, yet you are our widow for this season, and thankfully you have remarried. But let's just go back. Tell us a little bit about your first husband, Ericlee.
Definitely. Thanks for asking. Ericlee and I met on a mission trip to the country of Haiti. We both attended the same church, and I think we became just really good friends through those couple of years going on that trip. His grandparents were actually pioneer missionaries in the northern mountains of Haiti, and he was a runner and coach, and so he put together this trip that was really to put on a track camp for kids in Haiti. So being a runner myself, being a track athlete, I signed up for that trip, not really knowing anyone. I was still kind of new to town. I live in Central California, and so I got to know him really well, as well as the other people on that trip. We all became really tight friends, and that following spring, Ericlee actually invited several of us to help him coach track and field at the high school where he taught. So we just continued developing our friendship through that. I was very attracted to his leadership. He's just one of those very charismatic, passionate guys. We had so much fun together. But it wasn't until actually our second trip to Haiti, which was the following summer, that he proposed to me at a
Oh,
place
wow.
called the Citadel, which is this fortress that you climb up to in the mountains of Haiti. And he completely surprised me. He had a ring in his pocket the whole time. So by God's grace, he brought us together that following year.
Wow. So, a year you met on a mission, you're engaged, he proposed, you're engaged. What's next?
Well, then we started planning our wedding. I mean, obviously, I'm kind of giving you the quicker version of this, but I knew that I had fallen in love with the country of Haiti first, actually, before I fell in love with him. And so I spent a couple of months there where I was teaching English on my own. He and I were writing letters, and then we ended up getting engaged that summer. So we planned our wedding. We got married in the spring, and that was just the beginning of our adventures together. I knew that in marrying Ericlee that we would definitely be spending some time in Haiti, that serving together was one of the things that had really brought us together as a couple. And then we ended up starting to have our family a couple of years later. So we had three daughters together. I am a girl mama.
Girl, mama. So, you all are in love. You all are not only doing life together, you are doing ministry together, serving God's people, spreading His word, spreading His name. And Eric Lee develops cancer. What was that like?
Well, to be honest, it was a huge shock to us. In 2014, the beginning of that year, we began to notice that he had this kind of bump that was on his hip. And because he was an athlete, he was a triathlete, run, we kind of figured, and also in talking to some other professionals, that he had some kind of a sports injury, but he really didn't have any pain. So we began to see this bump on his hip continue to grow. And long story short, we finally did have a PET scan that was done, and they verified that, in fact, he had a tumor. So he was diagnosed in May of 2014 with stage 4 melanoma cancer. Um, we had known that in a couple years earlier that he had some different moles removed, but we had no idea that it had developed to that degree. So when we received that news, we had a full schedule planned of welcoming mission teams, going to be living in Haiti with our daughters. I was actually operating a fair trade jewelry project that employed women in Haiti. And so everything came to a screeching halt, as you can imagine, when we got that diagnosis. We knew that we needed to cancel our trips. We knew that we needed to look into treatment immediately. Stage 4 is pretty grave. And we were shocked by that. And just to make that story short, it was a short amount of time. We did some treatments right away, but in 3 months, then he went to heaven in September of 2014.
3 months is a short amount of time, to have been living a really robust life, not only with Ericlee, but also with your three girls. How did you grieve? You're looking back now. So tell us about that journey of grieving the loss of your husband. And you all had been married for how many years?
We had been married for 11 years, I think, at that time. Yeah. Thank you for that sensitive question. Of course, I had no idea what it was going to look like. I never imagined that I would lose my husband so quickly. And I felt like as a mother, it's something that you don't have in your tool belt of how do you teach three young girls how to navigate grief when you're also navigating grief yourself. Looking back, I think the first thing that I did was just in seeking the Lord and his guidance, I really started to prune back the things that I was involved with so that I could be present for my kids and for my own grief. And so I made a really hard decision at that point to step back from our ministry in Haiti. So I removed myself from the board and I actually kind of passed the torch of our jewelry project to two women who were dear friends of mine, to let them lead and direct. And so that afforded me the time that I could stay home full time with my kids here in California. I was still working at the time, teaching at Fresno State University. So I did have a part-time job, but just being able to be present here with my kids and lean into our community, not traveling back and forth between countries anymore. And that was probably the hardest decision that I made. But in terms of our grief, it was really important because what I did, and not even totally realizing, just following Jesus and what he was telling me to do, is I alleviated a lot of that stress and burden that was on my heart. And obviously, because my husband and I operated this nonprofit organization together, there was so much wrapped up into that I needed to give myself space from. So that was part of our grief journey, really. I'm so grateful for the wonderful community of friends, family, even other widows that God gifted me during that season, especially those first couple of years were so hard. But in them, God was Emmanuel to me through people. He was God with me through the people that he surrounded me with in that season.
Tell us about the journey. So you made space in your life. That's what you did for yourself and to be a mom during that grieving process. What was it like for your three daughters?
Every grief journey is unique, and all of us, depending on our personality, maybe the ways that we were brought up, some of our cultural experience and our culture's way of dealing with grief, each of us have a unique journey. And so I quickly realized that all three of my girls, they are unique personalities, and they were grieving in unique ways. They were pretty young, so when their daddy went to heaven, my youngest was age 2, my middle daughter was age 5, and then my oldest was 8. And so I got to watch them grieve, and really my goal was to give them permission to grieve in the way that God designed them. So just as a couple of examples of that kind of diversity in the way that they grieved, my youngest, who was 2, she was with me through that summer when he was sick and serving him. I was his caregiver around the clock, and she was with me. So she saw that with her eyes. She experienced that quick deterioration of her daddy's body, but she was also very just present And so some of the ways that God just worked in her, she is a music lover. And so she would sing. She would sing her little heart out, and she would create these kind of narrative songs where she would be telling the story of her daddy, and she would be working out her questions and singing at the top of her lungs. And at first it kind of alarmed me, but then I realized there is such honesty. It was like the Psalms or the Lamentations that God used that gift of singing. And now, even she's 8 now, and she's still a singer. And you can see how God used that in her and her little personality to help her work out her grief. My middle daughter, who was 5 at the time, she was perhaps the most fragile emotionally. And we, talked about that with my mom, my mother-in-law, a little bit before. And she was also the most expressive. So she would cry. She would tell us about missing her daddy. She would be able to articulate her grief journey in ways that her sisters weren't able to. And at the same time, I've seen the biggest transformation in that girl, because God has built this resilience in her through the years. And so for a child who was so fragile, especially those first couple of years, even struggling in school and struggling with different things, now I see how she is very driven. She is the one who wants to hear all the stories about her dad from the past. She even attends a school now where he used to teach, and he actually attended as a student. So it's really interesting, because when she started to go to that school 2 years ago, she went around bravely and boldly to the different teachers and asked them, did you know my daddy? Would you tell me a story about, him and your friendship? And so it's really sweet how she's kind of my storyteller. She's my memory, that she remembers those things and she treasures them. And then lastly, my oldest, she was 8 at the time. She's almost 14 now. She'll be 14 this Thursday. And she was one that was a little bit more reserved with her emotion. She didn't want people to see her cry. But what I noticed about her is that she had a strong sense of responsibility. She was the oldest, and so she was my partner. She was by my side, if I was doing housework or if I was grieving or crying myself, she was with me. And that's very much the young woman that I see also growing today, is that, she has a heart of compassion. She is very responsible. She is on top of her stuff. She helps me run my schedule over here. And I think it's because she did have to kind of grow up quickly right there. Those years were really formative, and she was helping me take care of her sisters. I never wanted to put that as a burden on her, but it was something that she kind of stepped up to the plate. So that kind of gives you, a little montage of how each of us dealt with our grief separately and then together, kind of collectively as well.
Thank you so much for sharing those examples. I am confident that there is going to be a mom who's a widow who's listening to that, who will be encouraged by that, and it will help them in their process, because as we know, there's healthy ways to grieve and there's unhealthy ways to grieve. But as you mentioned earlier, you didn't know you needed that tool in your toolbox. And so you are just, with those words, equipping some moms. So whether they're in that place or if they unfortunately have to experience such a loss, they'll hear your voice and your words as their children, as they continue to raise their children. Your story, love story, did not end with Ericlee. I'm sure he is still in your heart, and yet you found love in someone who was at your wedding, who was in your wedding, your now husband, Shawn. Tell us about that love story.
Well, it is a wild story of God's redemption, and just an encouragement to everyone that God is our ultimate kinsman redeemer, but sometimes he is working on behalf of us in ways that we could never imagine. So Shawn actually was one of my late husband Ericlee's best friends. They grew up, they were both track athletes, and so they loved to talk about running. They knew each other from church. They had met years before I had even met either one of them, but I met them both on that first mission trip to Haiti. And Ericlee was our leader, as I mentioned before, but then Shawn ended up being my prayer partner on the team. So he and I got to know each other pretty well. And after Ericlee and I got married, Shawn had remained a really close friend of our families. Like you mentioned, he was in our wedding and he gave a speech at our wedding. So he was an integral part of our community. Our families knew him well. My parents knew him well. And for a while, he lived in Baltimore, Maryland. For about 9 years, he had taken a job out there, but we stayed in close contact with him. He supported our ministry. He always prayed for us. And whenever he came back to Central California, which he would usually do maybe once or twice a year, he would come and stay with us, or at least we would go to dinner together. So he was someone who was really involved in our lives throughout that whole time. And basically, because God is sovereign and he's working out all the details in ways we can never imagine, he had put into Shawn's heart almost a year before my husband died that it was time for Shawn to move back to California. And his mother, who is a widow, she had some health problems. And just through God working on his heart, through some sermons he heard at his church, he had a heart for widows. And he realized that he wanted to be home and present for his mom during some time where she was struggling. So he began looking for a job. And Ericlee and I were praying for him. We were hopeful for him. We were excited about our friend moving home. And by God's amazing grace, my husband, Ericlee, went to heaven, as I said, in September. Shawn flew out for his funeral. He read some scripture at his funeral. And that very weekend, he was called for an interview at UCLA. And he said to them, this is kind of wild, but I'm actually going to be in California this weekend going through LA. I could even meet you in person, because they asked him if he could do a Zoom interview. So he interviewed for this job, unbeknownst to me. I don't know any of that detail at all, obviously grieving my husband. And he went for that interview. He flew back home to Maryland, and they offered him the job. And so God began this amazing journey for him to even be moving back to California long before any of this stuff happened with my husband's health. And kind of to skip ahead a little bit, there's so many fun details to the story, but I reached out to Shawn a couple of weeks after the funeral because of him making that special trip out. And he was also an Ironman athlete. So he had competed in an Ironman event, and basically he had dedicated it to Ericlee. And he had written his name and scriptures on his arms, and just on social media just shared the pictures that this race was dedicated to his dear friend. And it just touched my heart so much to see all the people that Shawn knew and I knew that were just congratulating him. So I called him, and it was kind of maybe a brave move at the time, but he was just a friend of mine. I wanted to thank him. And that sort of started this thing where we would talk to each other regularly. So about once a week, my kids would go to a grief circle that was here locally, and I would talk to Shawn on the phone for that 1 hour that I had. It was like the only time I had to myself. And little by little, I began to see that something was changing in my heart about Shawn, and I was afraid of it, to be honest. I was definitely not dating or looking to that, but I saw that God had brought this friend into my life. And he came to Fresno to visit us, and he was going to share dinner with us, which is something we would always do when he would come to visit. And I remember distinctly that night that when he walked in the door, I knew there was something different. It was like that fluttering in your heart where you're like, oh boy, Jesus is doing something that I didn't expect. And I had some mentors and friends, my mom, others who had encouraged me to have an open heart. My heart had been broken, of course. I had a wonderful marriage with Ericlee. And so I had to just really surrender to the Lord. But I began to see through that first time where he came to dinner with the girls and me, and even in the weeks to follow, that God was doing something really unique. And so we start later in August that we decided, and he proposed to me to get married. And it was wild because, the timing maybe some people would think is quick, But I prayed so much and he prayed so much. And every single person that I shared this with, they said, we had on our hearts that God was going to do this. We know the type of friendship that you have. We trust Shawn. We see his rapport with your girls. And like everybody immediately was giving their blessing. And I was kind of shocked. I was like a little bit taken aback. But it's the thing that God used in my life to really affirm me, because I knew that my people would be honest with me if they felt like it was not from the Lord. And so we ended up actually getting married in January of 2016. And God, I always say, God brought my kinsman redeemer.
What did you tell the girls during this process? They're still grieving their dad. Mommy is finding a new love, you know, brought by God. Yet this is all happening fairly quickly. What did you tell them? How did you what was that like?
You know what? That is such a good question. And it's very different, I know, for everyone. In this case, Shawn and my girls, they knew each other. And so he he had been there, to visit us when each of my girls had been born. They didn't know him super well, but at the same time, he was not a new face to them. And so we slowly just started to spend time together. We didn't, right away say, oh, we're dating and this is where we're headed, because we too were trying to be very prayerful and mindful. And I was watching and observing how he interacted with them. And, he had never been a dad before. He had no kids. He had never been married before. So I think, especially in that time period, God also had to work in his heart, because he was very content being single. He was very involved in his church and his job. He was an athlete. He wasn't one of those guys who was just kind of sitting around like waiting for somebody to show up. He was very content in where he was becoming a dad, because he wasn't just going to be marrying me. He was going to be, adopting my three daughters as his children. So the girls actually had, little by little also fallen in love with him. I'll say it that way, that they respected him, but he really won their hearts by just loving on them, being present for them. And again, we have a unique situation because he could sit there and talk with them about their dad. He could tell stories. He could grieve with them. And so he really came alongside us in our grief journey. Even my oldest, who I was most worried about, she had the most time with her daddy who was in heaven. Just little by little, Shawn won her heart just by encouraging her. And I see that each of my girls have just such a wonderful and unique relationship with Shawn today.
That is that's beautiful. Very, very, very beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your journey with Ericlee, but also just being open and sharing your journey with Shawn, because as you said, it came quickly, yet thankfully you were surrounded throughout your grief process with people, mentors, and friends in the circle that knew you, that could speak life to you. And even as you said, you were open to hearing what they had to say. And so I think that is so important. As we are closing, what tips do you have for moms that are navigating widow life and being secure in accepting that they can fall in love again? Because I know that can be a challenge.
Mm. Oh, that's such a good question. And it's hard because we're all in different and unique situations. I happen to help lead an online group called Widow Mama Collective, and I started it a couple of years ago with three other of my widow friends who live around the country. We're all writers and speakers. And we started that group because we knew that questions like this come up in the hearts of young widows. The group is specifically for widows who are moms and who have younger kids. And so we're a place where we offer support and they can ask those questions. And I've been asked that question before. And my advice, or if I could call it that, is really just being able to pray about it. If you feel led that God is putting someone in your life, or perhaps, if you want to start dating before. Also, I think it is so important. You can probably guess I'm going to say this, that it's important that you have mentors and family who you trust, who can give you feedback, who will pray with you, especially if it's somebody that you don't know, you don't have that history with. I had that sort of privilege that Shawn had already been a part of my community. He wasn't someone new coming in, but I know that's not always the case. And so I think it's really important, first of all, to pray. Second of all, to be talking through those details with mentors and friends, people who are spiritually sound, who you can trust to give you some honest feedback. I think that's really important. And then I think it is important for us to just follow our hearts. There's certainly a longing when you have lost a spouse. There's a longing for that empty space to be filled. It's not for everyone. It doesn't mean that God's going to provide a husband for everyone. I know that each story is very unique, but there is that longing for that feeling. And so I think it's just being able to separate, okay, is this because I'm just missing someone being around, or is God leading this specific person into my life? Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. So good. Well, I know you also you do prayer daily. Um, and so I think it would be fabulous if you could end our interview with a short prayer for moms who are in widowhood.
Oh, thank you, Chelsi. Yeah, through this time of COVID-19 and sheltering at home, I decided to do this prayer broadcast. I had no idea it was going to last for 11 weeks. But daily at 7:30, I've been praying on Instagram and Facebook, and I would be honored to pray right now. Thank you for that invitation. Lord Jesus, I'm so grateful for this place where we can share stories honestly, where we can glorify you. I'm thankful for Chelsi, God, and just her vision for this podcast and for this place where it's safe to sit down at the table together and even to talk about hard things. And God, I pray that if there's any woman listening right now who is a widow, if there is anyone who feels alone, God, I think about maybe even others who are single moms, maybe in a situation where they are grieving. They're grieving the loss of a husband or grieving the loss of other family members. God, I pray that you would see those women today. I think about how Hagar saw you in the desert and she named you El Roi, the God who sees. And I thank you that you see each one today. I believe that there is someone who is listening right now who needs that word from you, that you see them, that they're not alone, that you are actually working underground on their behalf, Lord. And I don't pretend to know the details of what that looks like, but I pray that you would give them a peace that passes understanding. I pray, God, that you would give them wisdom and discernment for their present and for their future. And I just pray a blessing over their families, over their kids. God, I know it is hard to be a mama in general, and then to be a mama and to be a widow is an extra special assignment. And so I pray that for those women who are navigating that right now, that you would give them courage, that you would give them kindness, and that they would be filled with just a profound sense of your presence today, Jesus. And we want to lift this up in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much for the prayer. For those who want to find out more about you, your ministry, you're an author, you and Shawn have a book coming out. How can they contact you?
Probably the easiest place to find me is on my website. It's dorinagilmore.com, Gilmore with one L, and all my socials are linked there. I'm pretty much Dorina Gilmore on Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram's where I love to hang out. And also linked there, they can find out a little bit more about our new book called Walk, Run, Soar, which is a devotional coming out. And if you're interested in learning more about the Widow Mama Collective, that's a Facebook group. So I would love, if there's any widows listening, that they would come join us over there. Thank you, Chelsi.
Rena, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for sharing your story and your journey. And we appreciate it so much.